Glad that you're here with us on Morning Express. It's time to go to the newsroom, and I will be introducing the panel that we have this morning. To my extreme left, we have Patrick Gadar, who is a communications expert. And so you tuned yesterday, today, yes, in the nation. Yeah, it's interesting how you just message across. But welcome, good to have you. Next, we have Dr. Buka, who is the chair for media department in the Multimedia University, and great to have you as well.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Last but not least, we have David Ohito, who is the digital editor with us here at The Standard. Karibu sana. All right, let's start off with some of the things that's been happening over the weekend. Of course, one of the big stories that has been covered, and we here on KTN News and The Standard have been doing very huge coverage, is the elections in Tanzania. And I'll start with you, Gadara, on first of all, your take on how the coverage has been. I know we have reporters in several cities within Tanzania just to bring us results and how things have been going. But your take on how it's gone so far?
Well, I actually think that the media has done a pretty commendable job. I mean, they sent in, especially the Standard sent in reporters, I think, in advance of the elections. I think it was almost like a month.
Close to a month and a half, actually.
Yeah,
we had Ben Kitili's
camp there. Ben Kitili had gone down, you know, and stuff. So it was good to actually see them hashing out issues from there. I think it's the first time we're seeing such coverage of a regional election as opposed to just the national one. So on that score, I think the media has done pretty well. I like that they're following up while they're there. I just have one beef.
As usual. There's always something with Gadara.
I mean, there has been, KTN also has been guilty of this. They've been reporting that of how the CCM, the governing party, is headed for a win in both presidential and parliamentary elections, even though they are yet to count even half of the votes. So I'm not sure why I mean, I feel like almost the media is jumping the gun, you know. And they started this almost the day after the results are coming out.
One could argue that it is factual in the sense that
John Pombe Magufuli
has been leading all along.
Well, I mean, the polls are from before were pretty tight, you know. And this is very reminiscent of what happened in the Kenyan election. And this is how you build perceptions that people think that once my strongholds start coming in, then the election is being rigged. You know, when you've counted less than half of the votes, there's really no call, unless you're doing your exit polling or stuff like that. You really have no leg to stand on to say somebody is winning. All you can say is he's leading. You know. Now, when you say he's winning, and so then later on it turns out, it's the wording you're using and the expectations that the media is creating. You know, that somebody is definitely headed to a win when all he is of what has been counted, he's leading.
So the issue here maybe is the terms that they're using.
Yes, I think it's the terms and the expectations that you build.
Okay, yeah. Dr. Buka, your take on the coverage, and well, according to Gadara, maybe we need to use terms like leading as opposed to winning. Although if he's leading right now, it means so far he's winning.
Not necessarily. I think looking at the votes that have been counted, which might not necessarily mean that, you know, they're winning. And so it's a question of the kind of words that we use and the perceptions, and that is likely to create in the minds of those that are watching. But I think the coverage has been commendable, as Gadara has put it. Very good coverage, especially from the Standard KTN News. And I think we are now seeing part of the advantages of having an all-news station, you know, because, and a regional outfit at that. So the elections have been given the prominence they deserve. And, you know, for the first time, I think Kenyans have really followed the Tanzanian elections because of the kind of attention that it has received and the kind of prominence that those elections have received. So we are seeing a lot more of regional coverage as opposed to, you know, just getting stories from, you know, Tanzanian reporters. We're having a lot more reporters going into to cover the elections, and that's commendable.
Okay, yeah. David Ohito, on the digital front, how have we done?
Very good. We try to get information as is released by the Electoral Commission in Dar. But what we realize that the flow of tallies from polling station is not as fast as has been in Kenya. So quite a fair challenge for
as has been in Kenya, did you say?
Yes.
You were here in 2013?
Honestly, yes. You could see that the electronic board with, you know.
The one that got stuck.
Yes, that got stuck. So I think that has been a challenge for our journalists who are used to now faster release of info so that they could relate. That has been a fair challenge for them. But also the language of communication, which is basically Swahili, and trying to get those who can competently interpret results as they are announced in Swahili has also slowed down the way we get info here, rather than when we could pick bites which are in English. But above all, I think the journalists, Tanzania is a very vast country, have tried their best. Yeah.
All right, Dr. Booker, before you, I know you want to say something, but in regards to language and interpretation, this is Tanzania, which is Swahili speaking, mainly Swahili speaking, and Swahili for Kenyans is fairly understandable. We can just about get by. But now what happens when you go to regions, for instance, that speak French? Or German, or when we now go to the greater Africa, how do we overcome that challenge?
Part of it is in investing in the kind of journalists that we have, having them be competent in various languages. And I know that in terms of training, very few universities have courses, for example, in Swahili for communication. At Multimedia, we have one course that tries to do that. But again, I believe that there's room for improvement, because you cannot learn Kiswahili, in 4 or 5 months. It has to be an ongoing process. So that investment in the kind of journalists who can report in some of those languages. Interestingly, when I was following the elections, even for me as a Kenyan, just trying to follow through the Swahili, it takes a while for me to first translate back into English, before I can make sense out of it. But I think we have some journalists locally who are, very conversant in the language, and they were able to report competently. But of course, taking into account that, the language issue and the kind of Kiswahili that, the Tanzanians speak and the one that Kenyans speak, is somewhat different. And so that takes a while. And so a lot of investment. I think it's something that we need to think about, not just as media houses, but even for us in training, not just in training in English, for example, but looking at some of the languages that are spoken within the region, even vernacular languages, that maybe it's time for us to rethink, the language of communication, and not just limit it to English. So that's something that's
one of the challenges. Gadar, I don't know what you think on the language issue, especially now that you're talking about terms. And when you look at we'll come to vernacular, but when you look at something like Swahili, you may have one word that probably means 3 different things, depending on the sentence and depending on how you put it. How do you overcome that barrier of ensuring that we are accurate in what we report?
Well, I think there are 2 things here. First, the media has to, at least the Kenyan media there, has to define what its audience is. Are you beaming to Tanzanians or to Kenyans? If it's to Kenyans, then you use language that is understandable by Kenyans. I also think that we need to be careful about adopting the models that we see other international networks doing. Essentially, this idea of parachuting in journalists and then getting them out, so they don't spend as much time understanding the nuances of whether it's language or politics within these regions. So yes, it's nice that we went in a month before, but perhaps we could look at a model where we hire local journalists in Tanzania, who know the layout, who know what's being meant, and then perhaps we could then train them in speaking sort of Kenyan Swahili, if you will, in that sense. But I'll say one other thing about the coverage of the election itself. One other thing that I'm a bit not too happy about is coverage of the issue. I think the election has very much been covered almost the way the media covers Kenyan elections, which is really more about the politics of things, are not really the issues. And it would have been nice to see a distinction made. For example, what is the Kenyan stake in this election? You know, what are the two leading candidates saying? You know, do they have differences in how they would approach us? We know we've had problems with people, Kenyans, being required to have either work permits or being kicked out of there. We had a newspaper, the East Africa, had kicked out of Tanzania, you know, supposedly because of a cartoon. You know, but we need to be able to have, or to put the leading candidates and to articulate what their positions are in regard to Kenyan interests. So that when you speak to a Kenyan audience, you can say, well, actually, this is the guy we would prefer, even though we don't have a say in who they elect, but we can have an idea of what we would expect as Kenyans once so-and-so takes power. Is it more of the same? Will there be any changes, etc.? We know even within the EAC, Tanzania's commitment to the EAC has been questioned, you know, and stuff. So I would really have loved to see the issues articulated. You know, what's the election being run?
Yes, Dr. Buka.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add that one of the things that has been evident, even in the English news locally, is we don't, you know, the sound bites are also in Kiswahili. From the elections, especially when the journalists are interviewing, you know, some of the top contenders, or you know, those that are seeking elective positions, and you know, I don't know why that has been the case. Part of it could be that you know, either the fact that they are not able to get English versions of, you know, the interviews, or very little has been done to try and translate and you know what has been said. Of course, with translation, sometimes meaning is lost, and so there's an advantage of playing, you know, the soundbite as it is. Yeah. But I think there needs to be effort by, you know, the journalists themselves to try and make meaning for those that are not, you know, that cannot be able to speak the language. But you know, some of the things that Gadara is raising, you know, what's the, you know, how does Kenya stand to benefit or lose based on, you know, which party takes the lead? I think part of that has been covered, and you know, not as extensively as we'd have wanted it to, though. But you know, when, for example, KTN News set camp there about a month and a half ago, some of that, we saw some of that. Of course, not to the extent that we would want to see. The challenge of doing that right now is that all eyes are on who's going to win the election. And so maybe going forward, I think it would be important then that after the election, that is given a lot more coverage. But I think expecting that to be done now, you know, when everybody's waiting to see who's going to win the election, would be, I think that would be lost if that was covered now.
Ohito, in terms of what Gadara brought out, Kenyan journalists or journalists from other countries covering politics the way they cover their own. As Kenya, we do know how we do our thing. And when we go to Tanzania, maybe it's slightly different. Did we have an objective eye to understand the politics of the day in that particular nation and report it as per that, or do we look at it from our perspective?
Well, I think we remained objective, and let me remind Gadara that there's nothing professionally wrong with saying a candidate is in the lead. It's just like a football match. If it is halftime and one team is 1-0 up, you cannot at
that point.
Yes, that is what it means, and that is very factual, very accurate. There's no way you'd expect a journalist to interpret the difference of 500 million votes between two candidates, other than saying so and so is ahead with 500,000 votes. Very accurate, very professional, and that is how to tell the story. In fact, it would even have been better if there went data, say Magufuli, his graph is this long, and Loasa's graph is this
I think his issue was not necessarily that he's leading, but the fact that we say he's winning. He hasn't won.
When you lead,
it's like a race. You know, the marathon is not over until you cross the tape.
That is what leading means.
Actually, the analogy of marathon and of sports actually a bit misplaced here, because actually what we are having is, I mean, the votes that come in from wherever they are counted. You know, if you have less than half, you know, the election is already done. They've already voted. You know, if you have less than half, there's no way you can say who's winning. You know, and this is my point. And don't forget, I mean, right now we've got the Chadema guys saying that, well, what we are hearing is not necessarily reflective of how the vote was actually cast. They're having the same issues that we had in 2013 and even worse in 2008. You know, but the jumping the gun, the declaration of some people. I mean, look at your own headline here in the Standard that says Magufuli is headed for victory. You know,
surely he is headed there. We have mapped out where the votes are.
Yes, he may be leading, but the idea that because he is ahead, he is winning, you know, is what got us into trouble. You know, in 2008, got us again into trouble in 2013. It's almost like we don't learn. You know, yes, he is leading, but let us qualify this. You know, to say he is winning, I think is a bridge too far, if you ask me.
How does that work, Gadara, from your opinion? How does that work to polarize or have the opposition feel like it was not fair? Because like you've mentioned, the vote has already been cast. There is nothing else that's going to change between now and then. Yeah. So all we're saying is he is leading, and if he continues the way he is, he's the winner.
Yes, but to say he is winning is very different from saying he's leading. And the second thing is, when we have, like now, a pretty close run elections, people do respond to this pressure, so the perceptions that the media creates, and it's got to be careful. You know, I think we really need to be careful about what perceptions we are creating. You know, because if it turns out that a bit later on they start, other guys start coming in, then suddenly you are no longer winning. You know, it creates issues, you know, where people think that, as they did in 2008, that, okay, the election now is being rigged, you know, people are changing numbers because so-and-so was winning, you know. I'm just, my point is that we need to be careful about perceptions we have, especially in this close-run, polarized election, so that we don't engender certain opinions that tomorrow might come and bite us in the ass, you know.
Okay. I would remind you that
behind, I guess, is a better term to use. But anyway, yeah. Now that we're on air.
I would remind Gadara, my good friend, that I looked at about 8 wire stories, and all these by very authentic media houses: Reuters, AP, AFP, BBC, Voice of America, SABC. Our headline is not different from what they said. So I don't know the kind of journalism that Gadara expects us to practice.
Although it doesn't make it right just because BBC have done the same thing.
Not really, but you know, that is the standard practice of reporting elections all over the world. I mean, if a candidate is in the lead, you cannot reverse.
No, you can say he's in the lead. I have no problem with saying he's in the lead. To say he's winning is a different thing. That's the point I'm saying.
Dr. Booker, are these just semantics? Are we splitting hairs on non-essentials? As a lecturer and one who operates in a classroom setting, is there a language that is acceptable to use, especially in this kind of event, given that it could create a certain frame of mind?
I think there's a way that journalists are trained to think and to look for, you know, what's the headline? I mean, what's the big thing
catchy?
What's catching?
What sells?
What sells, thank you. And that then becomes the driving force, even in terms of deciding what headlines and what words to use. But, you know, as Gadara says, maybe it's time for us to rethink that. You know, taking into account the fact that we have seen, you know, from history, that that has not been the case, where a candidate is leading but does not necessarily win the election at the end. And the kind of perceptions that is likely, you know, to create, which would be the lessons learned, you know, from election coverage in the past. But I would not blame media for the kind of headlines that we are seeing, because that is the orientation, that's the kind of thinking, you know, that journalists have been trained to have. That's the practice, and that's why Ohito is even pointing to certain examples of how other media houses have covered it. But that does not mean that it is not time for us to sit down and ask ourselves, is this the way to go, you know, in terms of coverage of elections in a continent or a context that is highly polarized, you know, along, for example, ethnic lines, that is very divided. You know, you have government, you have the, you know, the ruling party, and you have opposition. You have a transition, and how to manage that in such a way that it doesn't, you know, fuel conflict going forward would be something for us us to think about. And I believe that, you know, that even after this kind of coverage, that media houses sit down and ask themselves, how did they do? But the motivation always is, what is it that sells? And if that is what sells, then Ohito is going to run the headline that
we work for our audiences, and we owe them answers. Any audience member who picks up the newspaper today will not ask Gadara how the election faring is and the nitty-gritty. They will ask the question, who is winning? And they expect the editor and the reporters to speak to them. And which is why we are saying Magufuli is winning, and we justify by statistics that after 100 stations is way ahead by 500,000 votes. We are right. I have no apologies about that headline. And I think it continues.
All right, so let's move on to something else, and I want to come to the Freedom for Access to Information bill, which I believe Priscilla Nyokabi will be proposing today. And I wanted to have a read and a good look at what it really proposes, but I think, David Ohito, you have a lot of information on that. And maybe you can, first of all, update us on what it's all about and how it is likely to impact our coverage and information that we give to the public.
Thank you. A very pertinent question, and really what I call a defining moment for the media this week. One, because Article 35 of the Constitution, it talks about access to information, that every citizen has a right to access information held by the state. They have a right to access information held by another person, and that they can seek by way of writing or asking that the government gives, say, data or information on where Eurobond money has gone, for example, and they get detailed. That has a lot of impact on how our journalism will work. Today, there are still lots of what we call government secrets, information which you cannot access, yet it is held by state, allegedly on behalf of public or for reasons of public interest. When this law is enacted, and by the way, it's overdue because it's one of the laws which should have been passed by August this year. And I think the Ministry of Information has literally failed. They should have published that bill. Priscilla Nyokabi has moved in to publish the bill as a private member's motion. Kenya has been struggling to have this legislation in place, and I remember in the 90s, I think Anyang' Nyong'o tried to publish the bill, but it didn't go through. So we have really been waiting to have this law published. It will really impact the way media works. It will impact the way members of the public access information. It may define how we make public participate in, say, budgetary processes, by saying we want to know why this money has been allocated to a governor's office, to an MP's office, to State House, and so on. So for us, really a defining moment. But more important, remember, tomorrow we resume the full hearing of the cases which challenged Kenya Information and Communication Amendment Act 2013 and the Media Council Act, which tried to gag the media from accessing information. So for me, from where I sit as a media activist and as a journalist, I really see this as a defining moment. And we also expect the Powers and Privileges Bill to be voted for today.
That's today?
Yeah, when the offensive clauses to the media are finally expunged.
All right, Gadara, your take on freedom for access to info and how that would improve our journalists' ability to give information. One of the things that you've always said consistently is that we never follow up the story. We never give the full picture. Would this help us enhance and give that picture now in a broader perspective, because we can legally demand for information?
Well, yes, it can. I mean, it's another tool. The question is whether the media will be wanting to use it.
You think we may not use it?
I think as it stands, the record of the media in actually following up stories is much less to do with the information that's actually available, rather than their proclivities or their insistence on really reporting the politics of things as opposed to the issues of things. But that said, I think the bill is a good thing. I'd want to really see the text of it. I think that's where we need to concentrate on. What are the caveats that are given? You know, so that we know what is it, because some of these bills come as their disguises fed in within it. So that it looks like the government is being open, but then you find there are certain caveats, there's certain information you can't get, etc. So I would really want us to scrutinize, I haven't seen it, but I really want us to be careful before we bang our drums and be happy, is we actually scrutinize the text of the bill and see. One of the things that I think is important for us and we should be pushing for is why the government, there's some information, for example, wealth declarations are still a secret, you know, but nobody in government is allowed to publish it. Would this change that? You know, I don't think so. You know, so there's things we still need to push for government to be more open. When things are classified, is there a time limit where they run out and then we can access those things? So right now, do we know what government was doing in the 50s and 60s? You know, what documentation it had, etc. When we look at things like shift award, etc., we should be able to access these documents and stuff. You know, so these are some of the nuances that we need to be careful about, that we don't just go saying, yes, you can write a letter to the Ministry of Information or Ministry of Defense, and then they will give you info. You know, the fact is, governments are very incentivized to keep information secret. That's why they do it. You know, they don't want you to know what they're doing in your name.
So maybe it's not time to celebrate yet until you've read the text.
Look at the text. You know, let's really scrutinize that text. You know.
All right, Dr. Buka, what are some of the things you'd want to see in that bill, if once it's out, that would give us more power and ability to do our job and give a more accurate report, as it were?
I think most importantly is for us to be able to interact with it and see what it says, because I haven't seen it myself. But one of the things that I would wish is there is, you know, what happens when you do not get, when, you know, that information is not accessible to you, and what is it that then media houses can do, you know, to try and get that information all the same. Because as Gadara said, you know, it might look good on paper, but until you start interacting with it and reading it, then you realize that there are too many caveats that actually make it difficult for you to be able to access that information. But also, what kind of information are you allowed to, you know, to access? That's also, you know, something that I'm hoping we would be able to see. And, you know, what is it that is, you know, information that, that is, you know, for public consumption, and what isn't. I think those need to be clearly defined in that. But I think, you know, we would need to see it and interact with it much more to be able to comment.
And Michael, there is a clause that really gives power to those who have been either defamed or have information published about them which is untrue. And the Constitution spells out that they have a right to seek powers for deletion or correction of the right information to be put out. So by and large, it will also, you know, whip up media houses to ensure that questions of accuracy are really in the right place, and that all that we publish, we have a remedial measure that those who are injured or who are carried in a way that really does not reflect the true story that they are, have a right to seek correction and clarification.
Okay.
Is that in the freedom of information?
Actually, yes.
Well, I'd love to see how it's worded, because again, when you have too many layers of legislation dealing with the same thing, we've got the Media Act, the Media Council Act, which deals with this, you know. And we saw recently the government trying to introduce another more legislation, in essence, to take away powers from the Media Council and put it in invest it in another government agency. You know, so if it's again been addressed within this bill, we really need to be careful that the whole idea of self-regulation of the Media Council being the place that you go to its complaints commission, where you go to say that, you know, a DCD has been published, you know, that is retained as a place of first resort. You know, we of course have libel laws and stuff, which I don't have a problem with, you know, but when we include so many other gaps, and it works to cut down the media and its its incentives for telling the truth, you know, it disincentivizes them by always having this sword of Damocles over their heads.
All right. Well, we'll wait and see the bill, and like you've said, we'll celebrate once we have read the fine print and see what it says and how it empowers us. Let's now look at another area, and this is with the digital migration. It of course opens up the plane for many developments in terms of having more coverage. And we have Royal Media, who launched a vernacular station. It's not the first one. We have others. We have Jata, we have Three Stone, we have Cast TV. So it's not the first one, but I'd like us to look at vernacular stations, and especially given the timing. Now that we're going to 2017, Kenya is a very tribal so far country, and how those stations would operate. There's regulations too, but let's start off with, first of all, Ohito, maybe your thoughts on vernacular stations and how they can be objective. For instance, can a vernacular station, if we take maybe Inoro, can they air a story about maybe a candidate who they're viewed not to be in their turf objectively, and that story is taken to be serious and not just, you know, maligning the candidate?
Very interesting question and debate already going on. I was in a meeting yesterday that was trying to look at the pros and cons of this. Yes, plurality there is. We are going to have more audiences and consuming content in their first language, which for me is a plus, and I think UNESCO should start thinking of awarding some media houses that direction. And two, it's going to be a very tricky decision on how they remain objective, fair, accurate, balanced, and giving a platform to people to say opposing versions. But if you look at the structures of the new tribal stations, they're only going for the big communities because therein there are numbers. The power of advertising is likely to be, you know, generated and proceeds made thereof. And the communities who have been marginalized traditionally from independence by mainstream media houses still remains or remain marginalized. I would have loved to hear TV station about Somalis, Turkanas, Samburus, you know, Kurias and Tesos, for example. But the main media houses, I think they're looking at numbers and the business that may like.
Again, at the end of the day, it's the person who writes the check.
Yeah, the bottom line. So what it will do, we all know the contribution of vernacular radio stations to fanning ethnic emotions and fueling to some extent violence, which we witnessed in the 2007-2008 election. And whether these stations, both TVs and radios, will be capable of doing fair, balanced stories that really do not whip up emotions remains to be seen, but it will be very difficult. I'm trying to imagine how, for example, Njata and Inoro will give fair and equivalent airtime to an opposition candidate running against Uhuru Kenyatta. I'm trying to imagine how Ramogi TV, broadcasting in the Luo, may give a competitor of Raila Odinga, who is Luo, a fair coverage, balanced you know, platform in that profiling of the stories. So for me, it is a very big challenge. I don't think the Communication Authority nor the Media Council has the capacity to monitor these stations and ensure you are doing a good job as regulators. So I think
challenge right there.
It's big challenge going into the last 18 months to an election. We must really make sure that they don't do the things that happen in Tuosa.
Dr. Buka?
I think for starters, you know, with the digital migration, of course, it opened up the space. And what we now see is a lot of, you know, media narrowcasting rather than broadcasting, targeting very specific segments of the population. And one of those is, you know, then stations, you know, the advent of TV stations that are broadcasting in vernacular languages. But the motivation behind this and the proponents of these stations have commercial interests, you know, and that then becomes a driving force. Ohito said something earlier that, you know, when they're thinking of, for example, when a newspaper is thinking about a headline, who are they thinking about? The audience. And that's the same kind of mindset that is going into the establishment of these stations. That, you know, your target audience then becomes the driving force and the motivation for the kind of content that you're going to have.
Deliver.
And so it would be interesting to see, what is it that is in place to ensure that the content that is in these media houses, does not fuel, the kind of conflict that we saw in 2007, 2008 from radio stations. I know that the Communication Authority has a programming code, but is it the same programming code that has been used, for example? Do they have, I'm yet to see, whether they have a specific programming code for stations that broadcast, for example, in vernacular languages, because the programming code has been standardized. And that then points towards, certain challenges in terms of monitoring, in terms of ensuring that the kind of coverage that, the kind of stories that these stations are going to cover are all encompassing in terms of diversity of content. Because the audience that attends to that particular station has a certain expectation. If I'm going to sit down to watch Inoro, for example, there are certain there's certain content that I expect. If I'm going to sit down and watch Ramogi television, there's certain content that I expect to see. And oftentimes when we are nearing elections, audiences tend to move towards the stations that seem to be in line with their political affiliation. Right. And that, if that is going to be the driving force and is what is pushing these stations to get more advertising, then that is likely to be what is going to happen. I know that there has been Media Council and the Communication Authority do monitoring, but the way that that is done is by sampling content, and that in itself, in as much as from a researcher's point of view, is justified. Where media is concerned, would there be a different approach? Because sometimes in sampling, you might lose out on certain segments of the content that would be what you should be looking for.
Right, and to regulate. Yes. Gadara, in terms of the challenges that we are likely to see with mushrooming of these stations, and like Ohito mentioned, one of the things is that, of course, because the driving force here is also the ability to pay for the stations, is that we are obviously going to see the main communities, first of all, have their stations launched, and the marginalized remain silent.
Well, yes, I think, lots of what's going on with vernacular stations, which, by the way, I should preface my statement, my comments by saying that there's really no difference between broadcasting in English and broadcasting in Kikuyu or Luo or whatever. Fundamentally, there's no difference. It's just that there are many more people who know English than know Luo. But that said, we really need to be careful about the realities that then are painted by these stations. I think the biggest fear for me is that you get such a polarized situation such as we had in 2008, where audiences are being fed what they want to hear, and things are being taken to extremes, if you will, because the media, instead of really being objective and explaining the reality, is pandering to the audience, as Ohito suggested it's doing. So I think we really need to bedrock look at our journalistic skills, experiences, and ethics, and how the media that's actually existent at the moment is applying those. So that when we go to a situation where it's much more spread out, do we have a bedrock understanding of what the ethics or the practices are? Do we have the capacity, as has been mentioned by these two, to monitor and enforce things like the code of conduct, etc.? I think it's quite important that we look at that. Finally, I think we need to, a lot of this is happening in the private broadcaster space. We need to be asked about the role of our public broadcaster, KBC, who we actually pay for. And I think they used to have, I don't know what they still do, lots of sort of vernacular broadcasts. Do this continue? And going to your question about the supposedly marginalized communities, that the public broadcaster could step in here and pick up the slack where it's not, and it needs to institute a programming for communities that don't have their own, because the whole point is to ensure everybody is reached. But as I'll say again, we need to be careful that we're not creating different realities for different people.
Okay. All right, we've concentrated a lot on possibly the challenges. Dr. Booker, are there advantages that you see of having these vernacular stations? There must be some, surely.
I think there are advantages, but before I talk about the advantages, one of the perceptions is that it's journalists who are going to work in these vernacular stations, which might not necessarily be the case, because the first criteria is, can you be able to competently, communicate in that language?
Absolutely.
And a number of the journalists that we are churning out today are not able to competently communicate in their, what you'd call their, their native languages. Their vernacular is Sheng and is English and Swahili at best. And so how do you then recruit the kind of people that are going to work in these vernacular stations? The first criteria is, do they understand and can they communicate in the local language? And most of them, most of those are not people who have gone to to journalism schools, and so might not be conversant with what the ethical expectations of the practice is. And so that in itself presents a challenge. But the upside of it is that you then are able to communicate to people who for a long time have been disadvantaged as a result of language. And just a couple of weeks ago when we sat here looking at the CNN awards, one of the questions was do you have entries in vernacular languages? And as Ohito said earlier, that maybe it's time for us to start thinking about categories that take care of submissions, for example, that then are done in the vernacular languages of the people. So in terms of, yes, getting information access to as many people as possible, that's one of the advantages of it. In terms of opening up space for the creation of content, that's also a plus, because then these stations will be looking for content. And, that's one of the ways in which you're then able to create jobs for a number of people, of young people, or people who can actually be able to create content in those vernacular languages that these media houses can
David
have.
Ohito, closing comments, and if there are any advantages that you see with vernacular stations, very briefly.
Quite a number of advantages, Michael. When you look, the role of media includes education and entertainment. For the first time, you're going to have people being educated. Civic education remains a very big challenge in this country. And if you can have the media talking to the people in their first language, I think we will go very far. What we should avoid is getting people who are not professional journalists to run these stations.
All right, well, that's where we're going to wind up Newsroom. Thank you very much, David Ohito, who is a digital editor here at Standard Group. We also have Dr. Booker, who is the chair for Multimedia University Media Department, and Patrick Gadara, who is a communication expert. Thank you all for joining us right here on Morning Express. That's where we're going to wind it up, but do stand by. We've got news out in just a bit.